On my wedding day, just moments before I walked down the aisle, my sister Serafina cornered me. In front of my parents, she sneered, "Wearing that general's uniform, trying to prove you're not woman enough for a dress?" She didn't know my real family was waiting outside, all 500 of them. My name is General Tenna Floyd. On my wedding day, I stood before a full-length mirror, not in silk or lace, but in the deep, midnight wool of my Marine Corps dress blues. Here, in the hushed, wood-paneled quiet of the preparatory room at the Quantico Chapel, the uniform felt like a second skin. On my shoulders, 4 silver stars gleamed, a familiar, reassuring weight. Each star was a decade of my life, a promise kept, a battle won, a life I couldn't save. This wasn't just a uniform. It was a sworn oath woven from fabric and metal, the very map of my soul. Beyond the heavy oak doors, 500 guests were waiting. And at the end of the aisle, Julian was waiting. My Julian. My anchor, the brilliant civilian analyst who saw past the 4 stars to the woman beneath. He didn't just tolerate my world. He understood its language of sacrifice and duty. He loved Tenna. And for that, I loved him fiercely. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a sense of absolute peace settled over me. I had fought on every front imaginable, and today I was finally giving myself permission to be happy. A rare, genuine smile touched my lips. It felt like a victory in itself. That peace lasted less than 10 seconds. My phone buzzed against the polished wood of the vanity, a sharp, intrusive sound. My sister, Serafina. I had prepared myself for her usual brand of sarcasm, a text laced with just enough poison to sting. I had not, however, prepared for this level of raw cruelty. I picked it up. Her words glowed on the screen. "Wearing the general's uniform? What are you trying to prove, Tenna? That you aren't woman enough to wear a real dress?" A cold shock, like being plunged into icy water, seized my lungs. The words weren't just text, they were shards of glass. Before the pain could fully form, I saw the 3 little dots that meant she was typing again. A second blow was coming. It appeared instantly. "You've spent your whole life trying to be a man, but you'll never have their respect. You're just a joke in that costume." My breath hitched. The 4 walls of the elegant room seemed to shrink, closing in on me. Costume, joke. Her words weren't just an insult, they were an erasure. This was a surgical strike aimed directly at the core of my being. My identity, my gender, my life sacrifice, all dismissed with a casual flick of her thumb. It was a denial of my very womanhood on the one day I was supposed to celebrate it. Serafina's cruelty was the current that pulled me under. But it was my father who had opened the floodgates the night before. Her text made me remember his cold, impersonal call. He hadn't phoned to offer congratulations. His voice was that of the defense industry executive he was. The clipped, impatient tone of a man closing a deal he found distasteful. "Tenna," he'd started, foregoing any pleasantries, "your mother and I expect you to make a prudent choice tomorrow. My business partners will be in attendance. We can't have you turning your wedding into a military parade." I could hear the clink of ice in a glass on his end, the sound of business as usual. "Serafina is right," he continued, his voice flat. "It's garish. Wear a white dress. Be a normal woman for one day. Don't embarrass the family." "Embarrass them?" I'd whispered, the question hanging between us, heavy with the weight of my service. As if my honor, the very thing I had bled for, was a social liability. His response was more brutal than any insult. He said nothing. His silence wasn't empty. It was a judgment. It was a final, crushing verdict that my 4-star rank, my life's work, was not a source of honor, but a corporate inconvenience. I'd hung up the phone, the dial tone buzzing in my ear, my heart shattered. Now, standing in the chapel, his dismissal and Serafina's venom swirled into a toxic vortex. The door creaked open, pulling me from my daze. Master Sergeant Diaz and Sergeant Rocco stood in the doorway, their own dress blues immaculate. They were 2 men who had walked through fire with me in Fallujah, their loyalty forged in shared combat. They said nothing. They didn't need to. They simply snapped to attention, their salutes crisp and perfect. Steeling myself, my hands trembling slightly, I stepped out into the grand narthex of the chapel. The sound that greeted me stopped me cold. It wasn't the polite murmur of guests. It was a silence, an absolute, thunderous silence, heavy with reverence. The entire hall, from the front pews to the back walls, spilling out onto the steps, was a sea of midnight blue and scarlet and gold. Not 50 guests, not 100. 500 United States Marines, all standing at perfect attention. I saw the campaign ribbons on their chests, the weathered faces of combat veterans standing shoulder to shoulder with young privates whose own stories were just beginning. They had come from across the country, uninvited, answering a call no one had officially made. A young recon Marine I knew as Kincaid, a man I'd pulled from a burning Humvee years ago, stepped forward. His voice was thick with emotion, but it carried through the silent hall. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "We heard you might need an honor guard. We will not let you walk in there alone." As he finished, a sound like a single, sharp thunderclap echoed as a forest of arms rose in unison, 500 hands snapping into a salute. In that single breathtaking moment, a profound truth washed over me. My family of blood had cast me out. But this family, my family of blue and scarlet, my family forged in fire and bound by honor, they would never leave my side. And in that moment, held aloft by their unwavering loyalty, I had to ask myself the question that had shadowed my entire life. Why is it that the people who share your blood are so often the first ones to want to see you bleed? The question echoed in the silent chapel, a ghost that had haunted me my entire life. Why do the people who share your blood always seem to be the first to want to see you bleed? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't a single act of betrayal, but a long, slow poisoning. A masterclass in psychological warfare taught by my own sister, Serafina. My first memory of her sabotage wasn't a fight. It was a smile. I was 7 years old, standing proudly by my project at the elementary school science fair in our small Pennsylvania town. I had spent 3 nights meticulously crafting a model of the solar system out of styrofoam, paint, and papier-mâché. It wasn't perfect. Jupiter was a bit lopsided and Saturn's rings were slightly askew. But it was mine. My teacher, Mrs. Davison, was praising my work, her kind words making my small chest puff out with pride. Serafina, who was 9, stood beside us, beaming with a smile so sweet it could have melted butter. The moment Mrs. Davison turned her back, Serafina tripped. Her arm swung out in a comically exaggerated stumble, and the full cup of orange soda she was holding arced through the air. It landed with a sickening splash right in the middle of my delicate papier-mâché universe. The planets dissolved into a sticky orange pulp. "Oh, Tenna, I'm so sorry," she cried, her eyes welling up with perfectly formed tears. "I'm such a klutz." My parents rushed over. They cooed over Serafina, stroking her hair. "It's okay, sweetie. It was an accident," my mother soothed. Then they turned to me, my face streaked with my own real tears as I stared at the wreckage. "Don't make your sister feel bad, Tenna," my father said, his voice firm. "It was an accident." I stood there, looking at my ruined work, and for the first time, I understood a devastating truth. An apology could be a weapon, and a smile could be a mask for cruelty. As we grew older, her methods became more refined, her artistry of destruction more subtle. At 16, her weapon of choice was the family Thanksgiving dinner. The entire extended family was gathered around the polished mahogany table, the air thick with the smell of turkey and my mother's sage stuffing. My father, in a rare moment of paternal interest, asked about my academic progress. I had just gotten my SAT scores back, and they were nearly perfect, a number that could open doors to any university in the country. Before I could even form a response, Serafina cut in, her voice dripping with false pride. "Oh, our Tenna is doing so wonderfully. She even joined the school's wrestling team, you know. She can pin boys twice her size." A sudden, awkward silence fell over the table. A few of my uncles chuckled uncomfortably. In one perfectly crafted sentence, she had twisted my academic achievement into a joke about my perceived masculinity, painting me as a freakish Amazon. She made my strength a liability, my discipline an oddity. My father, mortified, immediately changed the subject, launching into a glowing monologue about Serafina's latest victory with the debate team. I sat there, a piece of turkey stuck in my throat, feeling utterly invisible, a stranger at my own family's table. The peak of her art, the masterpiece of my isolation, came on prom night. It was a cultural rite of passage I had no interest in. Serafina, of course, was prom queen. A vision in a shimmering gown my mother had driven 3 hours to Philadelphia to buy. I, having not been asked and having no desire to go, was perfectly content to spend the evening at home reading a book about military history. But Serafina, ever the benevolent sister, couldn't allow me that peace. In front of our parents, she put on a display of magnanimous concern. "Oh, maybe Tenna should come along anyway," she suggested, her smile radiating false kindness. "She could help the teacher's chaperone. She's so good at giving orders, after all, right?" The words, wrapped in that sweet smile, were a public execution. It was a declaration that I didn't belong with the other kids, that my natural place was on the sidelines, a rigid, joyless authority figure. And my mother, instead of defending me, chimed in with enthusiasm. "What a wonderful idea. You should go, Tenna. It'll be fun." That night, I locked my bedroom door, turned up my stereo as loud as it would go, blasting rock music to drown out the sounds of their laughter and the distant thumping bass from the high school gym. I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I had to escape. This house wasn't a home. It was a cage designed to shrink me. My escape plan was a secret act of rebellion, an application for a Marine Option NROTC scholarship. It was my one shot at a different life, a world where merit, not manipulation, was the currency. I prepared everything in secret, but I needed a letter of recommendation from a retired Marine colonel who lived in our town. When his glowing letter arrived in the mail, Serafina intercepted it. My application was eventually returned, stamped incomplete. A frantic, desperate search of her room led me to it. The letter, crumpled and stained with what looked like nail polish, hidden at the very bottom of her laundry hamper. When I confronted her, she didn't even have the decency to look up from the fresh coat of crimson she was painting on her nails. "I was just trying to help you," she said, her voice a calm, infuriating purr. "You're more fragile than you think. They would eat you alive in the Marines. You'll thank me for this one day." That breathtaking arrogance, that self-appointed right to dictate my future, didn't break me. It didn't crush my spirit. It ignited it. The years of quiet humiliation, of swallowed anger and silent tears, finally coalesced into a single, burning point of resolve. I wonder if anyone listening has ever felt that way. A moment when someone else's attempt to break you becomes the very thing that builds you up. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a moment that changed everything. I smoothed out the wrinkled letter. I submitted my application again, and I swore to myself, with every fiber of my being, that this time I would not fail. I looked out my bedroom window, not at the familiar street, but at a distant horizon. If I couldn't earn respect in this house, maybe, just maybe, I could command it somewhere else. The words my sister had thrown at me like stones, "They will eat you alive," became the fuel for my fire. The oath of commissioning as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps was a brief, triumphant moment, a formal severing of the life I'd left behind. But the reality of that new life at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, was a sharp slap in the face. The thick, humid coastal air clung to everything, smelling perpetually of pine needles and salt marsh. The mornings began before dawn with the harsh, guttural shouts of gunnery sergeants, and every day was lived under the weight of scrutinizing, dismissive eyes. As one of a handful of female officers on base, I wasn't just a rarity. I was an anomaly. A question mark in their rigid, masculine world. In the mess hall, surrounded by the clatter of trays and loud conversation, I'd catch the whispers floating over from other tables. Must be a diversity quota higher. During operational briefings, my tactical suggestions were often met with a polite, vacant stillness, as if I had been speaking another language entirely. My very presence was a disruption to their established order. They gave me a nickname, One I never heard to my face but felt in their sideways glances and the sudden silence when I entered a room. The Ice Princess. It was because I didn't join in their crude locker room jokes, because I maintained a professional silence instead of forced camaraderie. I ate alone, I studied alone, I ran alone. My family's parting shots had inadvertently given me a gift, a total indifference to being liked. I wasn't at Camp Lejeune to make friends. I was there to command their respect, and I knew I couldn't win it in the gym. I couldn't outbench press them, couldn't beat them in a brawl. So I resolved to outthink, outwork, and outlast every single one of them. My battle wasn't one of muscle. It was a quiet, relentless war fought with numbers, strategy, and sheer, stubborn persistence. I was the first officer to arrive at the battalion offices each morning, the smell of stale coffee my only welcome, and the last one to leave long after the Carolina moon had risen. While the other lieutenants were blowing off steam at the bars in Jacksonville, I was in the base's combat simulation center, running tactical scenarios over and over until the digital battlefield felt more real than my own Spartan barracks room. My tactical reports were flawless, my logistical plans airtight, every detail cross-referenced and verified. I learned to field strip my M16A4 service rifle in complete darkness, my fingers moving with a blind, mechanical certainty, until the weapon felt less like a tool and more like an extension of my own arm. I didn't waste energy on words. I didn't argue or explain. I let the results of my work scream for me. The true test, the trial by fire, came during a grueling 3-day land navigation course set deep within the swampy, unforgiving forests of coastal North Carolina. It was a rite of passage, designed to break you down and see if you could find your way back. My nemesis was a fellow lieutenant named Decker, a swaggering, smug officer who seemed to take my existence as a personal insult. On the first morning, as we were issued our gear, Decker, with a sly grin, accidentally swapped my map with a faulty one and handed me a compass he'd tampered with, its needle subtly but critically misaligned. His plan was transparent. He wanted to see me fail spectacularly. He wanted me lost, alone, and forced to radio for a humiliating rescue. I didn't realize I'd been sabotaged until dusk on the first day. The setting sun cast long, deceptive shadows through the dense pine trees, and the coordinates on my map refused to align with the terrain. A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach as the sky bruised from orange to purple and the first drops of a cold rain began to fall. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in my throat, but it was immediately consumed by a white-hot surge of anger. I was alone, in the dark, with no map and no compass. But I wasn't helpless. Serafina had tried to sabotage my future by hiding a letter. Decker was trying to sabotage my career by hiding the path. The pattern was the same. The rage gave me clarity. I had the stars, which were just beginning to pierce the cloud cover. I had the prevailing wind. And I had a memory for detail that bordered on photographic. I had spent my lonely nights reading not just military history, but books on astronomy. I found the North Star. I oriented myself, and I began to walk, pushing through tangled undergrowth and wading through knee-deep, murky water. The thorns of saw palmettos tearing at my fatigues and my skin. On the morning of the third day, as Decker and his cronies were solemnly reporting me as officially lost to the supervising officer, I emerged from the tree line. My uniform was shredded, my face was smeared with mud and scratched, but my back was ramrod straight. I walked directly to the instructor's table, ignoring the stunned silence that fell over the room. I slapped my grid sheet down, the locations of all my waypoints marked with perfect precision. The silence was broken by the scraping of a chair. Gunnery Sergeant Gunner, a grizzled old-school Marine from the salt of the earth stock, a man who had never served under a woman and had only ever referred to me as Little Lady, pushed himself to his feet. He looked me up and down, taking in my disheveled state. Then his gaze shifted to Decker, and his eyes narrowed with a look of pure, undiluted contempt. He turned back to me. Without a word, he picked up a steaming metal mug of coffee from his own desk and held it out to me. My filthy, trembling fingers wrapped around its warmth. "Good work, Lieutenant." He didn't call me little lady. He used my rank. It was just 2 words, spoken in a gruff, gravelly voice. But for me, it was the first medal I'd ever truly earned. A medal paid for with darkness, with mud, and with a will that refused to be broken. It was a start. But respect in the barracks was one thing. I had to wonder, what about on the battlefield? The respect I earned in the pine forests of North Carolina was just a prelude. The battlefield has a way of stripping away all pretense, of testing respect not with words, but with blood. My test came in Anbar Province, Iraq. By then, I was a captain, working as a staff officer at a forward operating base. The air there was a permanent cocktail of diesel fumes, gunpowder, and fine desert sand that got into everything. Your food, your lungs, your soul. My job was planning, logistics, staring at maps in an air-conditioned container while others went outside the wire. It was safe. It was my duty. And I hated it. The call came over the radio network like a lightning strike, a burst of static and panicked voices that cut through the mundane hum of the operations center. A V-22 Osprey carrying a force recon team had been shot down on the outskirts of Fallujah. The survivors were pinned down, surrounded, taking heavy fire. A quick reaction force was being scrambled immediately. Everyone knew what it was, a suicide mission into the city's meat grinder. I could have stayed. I should have stayed. My job was here, coordinating support. But I looked at the digital map on the screen, at the flashing red icon indicating the crash site. I saw the roster of the Marines on that Osprey. I knew their names. I had planned their mission. I had sent them there. A cold, heavy sense of responsibility washed over me. It wasn't guilt, it was ownership. I grabbed my rifle, slapped on my helmet, and ran out into the blinding Iraqi sun. I jumped onto the last Humvee in the rescue convoy, ignoring the shocked look on the face of the platoon commander. There was no time to argue. We plunged into the city. Fallujah wasn't a city, it was a maze of death. Narrow, dusty alleyways turned into kill zones without warning. The air filled with the constant, high-pitched buzz of bullets, like a swarm of angry hornets. The crack of sniper fire echoed off the concrete buildings, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Then, the lead Humvee in our column was hit by an RPG. The world erupted in a deafening roar of fire and shrapnel. The convoy ground to a halt, a sitting duck in the middle of the street. Panic began to ripple through our radio net. I could hear it in the clipped, frantic voices. I could hear the desperate calls from the pinned-down recon team. Then I heard the voice of Sergeant Rocco, normally the calmest, most unflappable Marine I knew. It was trembling. "We're taking fire from all sides. We can't hold this position." In that moment, something inside me shifted. I was no longer a staff officer. I was no longer the ice princess. I was a Marine. I keyed the command channel, and my own voice boomed through the radio. A cold, clear growl that cut through the chaos. "All call signs, this is Valkyrie. Establish a 360-degree perimeter. Now!" Gun trucks, suppressive fire on those second-story windows. "Rocco, give me a sit rep on your casualties." My voice didn't betray a hint of the fear coiling in my own gut. That calculated calm, that assertion of control, pulled them back from the brink of chaos. It gave them a direction. Through the dust and smoke, I saw him. Master Sergeant Diaz, his leg bleeding badly, was trying to drag an unconscious Marine from the burning wreck of the lead Humvee. Enemy fire was converging on their position, kicking up plumes of dirt all around them. He was going to die there. There was no thought process, no weighing of options. A line from a Sunday school lesson my mother used to read aloud flashed through my mind. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." I was out of the Humvee and sprinting before I even registered the decision. The ground around me erupted as bullets stitched a path toward me. A piece of shrapnel, hot and angry, slammed into my shoulder. The force of it nearly knocked me off my feet, and a searing pain shot down my arm. But I saw the look in Diaz's eyes, the desperation of a good man trying to do the impossible. I gritted my teeth against the pain, reached them, and together we hauled the unconscious Marine behind the cover of a low wall just seconds before the Humvee's fuel tank exploded in a massive fireball. As I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, I felt a pair of eyes on me. From a rooftop across the street, providing cover fire, Sergeant Rocco had seen the whole thing. I woke up stateside, in the sterile white world of Walter Reed. The pain in my shoulder was a dull, constant throb, a reminder of the fight. But it was nothing compared to the quiet in the ward. The other wounded Marines in the room, men with injuries far worse than mine, no longer looked past me. The whispers were gone. The dismissive glances had been replaced by something else, something I hadn't seen before, a quiet, solemn respect. A few days later, Sergeant Rocco, a fresh scar tracing a line across his cheek, walked into my room. He didn't say much. He just placed a cold can of Coke on my bedside table, the red and white of the can a stark contrast to the drab hospital sheets. "Thanks, ma'am," he said, the word ma'am sounding different than it ever had before. It wasn't just a formal address. It was an acknowledgement. Later, I started hearing it. A new name, spoken in hushed but appreciative tones by the nurses, by other Marines who came to visit. It wasn't Ice Princess. They called me Ironclad. Ironclad. A name born of fire and smoke and a split-second decision in a dusty street in Fallujah. That name, given to me by the men I had fought alongside, became my true identity. It was more precious than any medal, more valuable than any star on my shoulder. It was a name I had truly earned. The weeks I spent at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center were a strange paradox of pain and peace. My shoulder ached with a deep, grinding throb, a constant reminder of the shrapnel still embedded near the bone. But for the first time in months, I slept in a real bed, under clean sheets, without the fear of a mortar attack waking me. The sterile, quiet halls of the hospital became a sanctuary. The other Marines in the ward, men carrying scars far more grievous than my own, no longer looked through me. The ranks and formalities dissolved, replaced by a shared, unspoken understanding. We were a brotherhood of the broken, sharing silent nods over morning coffee, trading stories of physical therapy nightmares, and finding comfort in the quiet company of those who knew the cost of war without needing to say a word. Master Sergeant Diaz and Sergeant Rocco visited almost every day, smuggling in real coffee to replace the hospital's bland brew and bringing news from our unit. In that sterile space, surrounded by my chosen family, I felt a sense of belonging I'd never known in my own home. I was naive. I let myself believe that perhaps the hardest war, the one against my own family, had been left behind in the dusty alleys of Fallujah. That fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. A nurse, trying to bring some cheer to the common room, switched on the television to a major news network. And there she was. My sister, Serafini, was on screen, interviewed in prime time. She sat poised and elegant in a designer dress, her face a mask of thoughtful concern as she spoke to a famous host about the burdens of war and the hidden strength of women in conflict. Then, a massive full-screen graphic appeared behind her. It was a photo of me, taken in the immediate aftermath of the firefight. But the image had been artfully cropped. My captain's bars were gone. The wreckage and chaos of the background were blurred into obscurity. All that remained was my face, streaked with grime, hair matted with sweat and blood, and the raw, determined look in my eyes. Serafina gestured to the image of my ravaged face. "My sister," she said, her voice filled with a beautifully modulated solemnity. "She is an inspiration to us all." The common room fell silent. Every Marine, every nurse, every visitor turned from the television to look at me, sitting in my wheelchair. The feeling that washed over me wasn't pride. It was a sickening, profound sense of violation. I felt naked, exposed, my moment of sacrifice and survival, stripped of its context and hung up for display like a hunting trophy. I had been turned into a prop for her performance. A few days later, she called. Her voice on the phone was as sweet as honeyed poison. "Tenna, darling, did you see the show? The entire country is talking about you. I've already spoken to a producer. We're going to do a documentary series about you, about women who break barriers. I'll be the executive producer, of course. This is your chance, Tenna. You're going to be an icon." I listened to her saccharine pitch, and a single cold question echoed in my mind. An icon for whom? For you? She never once asked how my shoulder was. She never asked if the nightmares had started. She just saw a story she could sell, a brand she could build on the foundation of my scars. Then my parents called, their voices, for the first time in my life, filled with genuine, bubbling pride. "Serafina is doing such a wonderful thing for you, honey," my mother gushed. "She's really helping your career." The anger inside me didn't explode. It didn't burn hot. It crystallized. It became a solid, heavy block of ice in my chest, cold and clear and sharp-edged. I turned my head and looked out the large window of my hospital room. Down below, on the manicured lawn, I saw a young Marine, his legs gone, struggling to master his new prosthetic limbs, his face a mask of pained determination. I saw another being pushed in a wheelchair by his wife, his eyes vacant and staring. That was my legacy. They were my legacy. Not some glossy, sanitized television show produced by my sister. I picked up the phone and called her back. "There she is, my little star." Serafina answered, her voice bright and cheerful, the voice of a predator who knows the trap has been sprung. I took a deep, steadying breath, the sterile hospital air filling my lungs. "Serafina," I said, my voice low and devoid of all emotion. "Listen to me very carefully. My story, my scars, and the lives of the men I serve with are not commodities for you to market." I paused, letting the silence stretch, making sure I had her full, undivided attention. "Do not ever use my image again." I hung up before she could utter a single word of protest. Then, with methodical precision, I opened my contacts list. I found her name and blocked the number. I found my father's name and did the same. Then, my mother's. The silence that followed in the room was absolute. In that profound quiet, surrounded by the quiet dignity of real sacrifice, I made a decision. My legacy would not be written by her. I would build my own. A real one. When I walked out of the sterile white halls of Walter Reed, I didn't return to my career as a celebrated war hero. I returned with a new, unwritten mission, one forged in the fire of my family's betrayal. The words of my fiancé, Julian, had become my new compass, a quiet directive that cut through the noise of my anger. "Don't just react to her, Tenna," he'd said, his voice calm and steady. "Build something she can never touch." So I did. Instead of accepting a prestigious and comfortable staff position at the Pentagon, the expected reward for my service in Iraq, I made a request that baffled my superiors. I asked for a transfer to a quiet, overlooked corner of the military's sprawling bureaucracy, the Veterans Support Division. My colleagues thought I was insane. It was seen as a career dead end, a voluntary step off the fast track to further promotion. But it was there, in a cramped, poorly lit office amidst gray filing cabinets and stacks of dusty paperwork, that I laid the first brick of what I privately called Project Aegis. The name was a promise, taken from the mythical shield of the gods, a symbol of divine protection for those left vulnerable. It wasn't a glamorous project. It began not with a formal announcement or a press conference, but with small, unseen, and relentless actions. I spent my days making phone calls, setting up coffee meetings in cheap diners with recently discharged Marines, and, most importantly, I just listened. I learned that the war doesn't truly end when a soldier steps off the plane. For so many, a new, quieter, and far more insidious war was just beginning inside their own minds. Using my own savings, the considerable back pay I'd accumulated while deployed, I hired a few dedicated civilian therapists who understood the culture. Together, we set up a discreet, 24/7 hotline, a completely confidential lifeline that operated outside the military's slow, impersonal, and often judgmental official channels. It was a small shield, but it was a start. It was through this fledgling network that I met Corporal Evans. We met in a dingy diner on the outskirts of DC, the kind of place with cracked red vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner for hours. In Afghanistan, Evans had been an elite sniper, a man whose hands were so preternaturally steady he could thread a needle from 1,000 yards. Now, as he sat across from me, his hands trembled so violently he could barely lift his coffee cup to his lips without spilling the dark liquid onto the table. He told me about the nights. The endless, suffocating, sleepless nights where he would lie in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the faces of men he'd killed replaying in his mind's eye like a horrific, looping film reel. He told me about the sudden, crippling panic attacks that would seize him in the grocery store, the overwhelming certainty that an IED was hidden in the cereal aisle. The official military system had processed him. They'd given him a handful of sleeping pills and a glossy, useless pamphlet on readjusting to civilian life. They had treated the deep, gaping wounds in his soul as if they were a minor administrative inconvenience. I spoke with him for hours, not as a general to a corporal, but as one survivor to another. I didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. I simply listened. I saw the profound emptiness in his eyes, an abyss of pain that felt terrifyingly familiar. In that moment, Project Aegis ceased to be a professional endeavor. It became a personal crusade. I was no longer just helping veterans. I was fighting an invisible enemy called PTSD, a silent killer that was taking my Marines from me, not on a foreign battlefield, but right here on American soil. The fight was lonely and deeply frustrating. While I was struggling to find funding, to convince skeptical colonels that mental health was as critical as body armor, I stumbled across a video on YouTube. It was Serafina. She was the keynote speaker at a major tech conference in Silicon Valley, looking polished and immaculate in an elegant white pantsuit. She stood on a brightly lit stage, speaking to a captivated audience about the importance of authentic listening and digital age healing. She spoke of empathy and connection, her words flowing with practiced sincerity, and the crowd gave her a thunderous standing ovation. A wave of physical nausea washed over me. I knew it was all a performance, a carefully crafted illusion. She, who had never truly listened to another person in her life, was being celebrated as a guru of connection. The jarring contrast between her slick, empty rhetoric in a California auditorium and my quiet, desperate battle in a greasy spoon diner in D.C. was obscene. She was selling platitudes. I was trying to save a life. The tragedy I had been fighting so hard to prevent came on a cold Tuesday morning. The call came not from a duty officer, but from Evans's mother, her voice shattered by grief. He was gone. He had taken his own life in the silence of his small apartment. A few days later, she sent me the letter he'd left behind. It was filled with apologies to his family, with words of pain and despair that were hard to read. And then, at the very end, there was a single line addressed to me. General Floyd was the only one who ever made me feel like I was seen, even just for a moment. The words on the page blurred through my tears. The sentence ripped through my heart, a clean, devastating wound. The profound grief I felt for this young man, for the life he would never live, quickly hardened into a cold, diamond-hard rage. My fight was no longer for a project. It was for Corporal Evans. It was for his legacy, and for the thousands of other soldiers, just like him, lost in the shadows, forgotten by the very system they had sworn to serve. I would not let them be forgotten. My quiet crusade was over. I would make the Pentagon listen. The real war, the war against the machine, had just begun. The war for Corporal Evans' legacy, the war to get Project Aegis formally recognized and funded, was entirely different from any battle I had fought before. My enemies weren't insurgents with AK-47s in dusty alleys. They were well-fed generals with stars on their shoulders, powerful politicians on congressional committees, and the vast, soul-crushing bureaucracy of the Pentagon itself. I presented my meticulously crafted proposals in cold, sterile conference rooms, facing a wall of skeptical, dismissive faces. They would listen politely, their fingers steepled, and then dismantle my life's new purpose with bureaucratic jargon. It's too expensive, General. It's not in the current budget cycle. This falls outside our strategic priorities. The most painful refrain was the one unspoken but clearly implied. They saw mental health struggles not as a sacred responsibility of the system, but as a personal failing, a sign of weakness in the individual soldier. They saw the invisible wounds of men like Evans as an embarrassment to be managed, not a debt to be repaid. Every day, I walked the endless, echoing corridors of the Pentagon, the polished linoleum floors stretching out like a sterile desert. I felt more alone, more exhausted in that climate-controlled maze of power than I ever had on a desolate battlefield under a scorching sun. I was fighting for the dead and the dying, for the men whose minds had become a war zone, but it felt like no one was listening. My own rank, which should have been a key, felt like a barrier, isolating me further. It was in one of those soul-crushing meetings, a cybersecurity briefing of all things, that I met Julian Croft. He was a civilian strategic analyst for the Department of Defense, a brilliant mind hidden behind a quiet demeanor and thick-rimmed glasses. Unlike the uniformed officers in the room, he wasn't dazzled or intimidated by the 4 stars on my shoulders. He just listened. After the briefing, while others were schmoozing, he approached me. He didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences for my cause. He asked questions. Sharp, incisive questions about logistics, about data architecture for the hotline, about metrics for measuring efficacy. For the first time, someone looked at Project Aegis not as a charitable pet project, but as what it was. A full-scale military campaign against a deeply entrenched enemy. He saw the strategic value, the operational necessity. We started having lunch together in the Pentagon's crowded cafeteria, our conversations a strange mix of military acronyms and analytical frameworks. But beneath the technical jargon, a deeper connection was forming, a mutual respect between 2 minds that saw the world in similar, structured ways. Julian became my sanctuary, my secure rear echelon base in a protracted war. He was the one I could vent to after another soul-destroying meeting, the one who would listen to my frustrations without judgment. He didn't just offer comfort, he offered strategy. He would take my arguments, help me refine them, find the logical fallacies in my opponent's reasoning, and hand me back my own ideas, sharper and stronger than before. One evening, I was slumped on the sofa in my small Arlington apartment, utterly defeated after a particularly brutal day. He didn't say a word. He just sat down beside me, handed me a mug of hot tea, and said quietly, "Attrition warfare is a valid strategy, General. Just keep showing up. They'll break before you do." Our love didn't blossom from flowers or fancy dinners. It was built in the trenches of shared battles, forged in the fires of intellectual respect. He proposed to me one Tuesday night in the most wonderfully unceremonious way imaginable. We were in our kitchen, making pasta together, the air filled with the smell of garlic and basil. He paused, a wooden spoon in his hand, and looked at me with that calm, steady gaze I'd come to rely on. "Should we make this official?" he asked, as if suggesting we buy a new piece of furniture. It was the most romantic thing I had ever heard. I said yes without a single moment of hesitation. When the news of our engagement was announced, Serafina launched her next, most public attack. It was more cruel than any private text message because it was designed for an audience. She posted on her public Twitter feed. The picture was a slick, provocative image, a pair of muddy, worn-out combat boots placed right next to a pristine, elegant slice of wedding cake. Her caption dripped with venom, disguised as wit. "When you marry the man or the military. Congrats to my commanding little sister on her engagement." She finished the post with a label, a cruel, searchable term meant to define me and invite public ridicule. Commanding bride. The phrase and the post went viral. It was picked up by gossip blogs and right-wing commentators, spawning a wave of mockery about the dictator bride, the G.I. Jane wedding. Memes appeared. My private joy was twisted into a public spectacle, a caricature of an aggressive, unfeminine woman who couldn't separate her job from her life. I stared at my phone, a cold, sickening rage making my hands tremble. She had taken my happiness, the one pure and simple thing I'd built for myself, and turned it into a weapon against me for public amusement. The humiliation was overwhelming. But as I sat there, reeling from the blow, I remembered Julian's words. I remembered the faces of the men in my unit, and I realized something profound. This time, I wasn't alone. Serafina's tweet ignited a firestorm, just as she'd intended. But the fire didn't burn me. It forged an army at my back. For a few agonizing hours, the mockery she had curated with her cruel, commanding bride label festered online, a digital stain I felt personally. But then something incredible, something powerful, began to happen. A counter-offensive, launched not from a command center, but from the living rooms, offices, and hearts of the American military community. Military spouses, grizzled veterans, and active duty soldiers I had never met took her label and claimed it as their own. They turned her insult into a rallying cry. The hashtag General Bride started trending on Twitter, followed by Botsi dress blue wedding and Och Ironclad's honor. Photos flooded social media. Women in uniform on their wedding days, their faces beaming with pride. Men standing proudly by their servicewomen partners, their salutes sharp and respectful. My official Pentagon email was inundated with hundreds of messages, not just from Marines I knew, but from soldiers, sailors, and airmen from every corner of the country, all with the same unwavering message. We stand with you. They offered to fly in on their own dime to stand guard at my wedding. The uniform, the very symbol Serafina had tried to weaponize as a mark of shame, had become my flag, a banner under which all the respect I had bled for was now gathering into an undeniable force. My only public response to the storm was a single, defiant act of quiet dignity. I posted a clean, simple photo of my dress blue uniform, hung and ready, on my private Instagram account. The caption was 7 carefully chosen words. This is what honor looks like. The day of my wedding arrived, a crisp, brilliant autumn day in Virginia. The historic chapel at Quantico was packed to the rafters, not with my father's business partners or Serafina's media friends, but with a tidal wave of uniformed service members. It wasn't 50, it was 500. 500 men and women in their immaculate dress uniforms, a breathtaking sea of midnight blue and scarlet and gold. They filled every pew, stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles, and spilled out into the narthex, their presence a silent, powerful testament. They had come on their own, no invitations required. From my hiding place in the preparatory room, I peeked through a crack in the door. I saw my parents and Serafina in the front pew, the space reserved for family. They looked small, fragile, and utterly out of place, 3 drab sparrows lost in a magnificent forest of eagles. They were islands of civilian clothing in a vast ocean of military honor. I could see the visible shock on Serafina's face, her perfect, media-trained composure finally cracking. Her skin, usually glowing, was pale. Her eyes were wide with a disbelief that bordered on panic. She had intended for me to be the spectacle, the joke. Instead, she had become a front-row spectator to a stunning display of my power. A power she could never understand because it wasn't given or inherited. It was earned. I stood behind the massive oak doors, my heart hammering against my ribs. Not with fear, but with a profound, surging anticipation. This was no longer just a wedding. It was a declaration. When the moment came, the chapel doors swung open. But there was no gentle swelling melody from the pipe organ. Instead, the air was split by a sound far more sacred to my ears. A single, powerful, unified roar from 500 throats. A sound that shook the very foundations of the old chapel. A sound of absolute respect. General, on deck! Instantly, as one, the entire congregation rose. It wasn't a shuffling, polite gesture. It was a single, fluid movement. A forest of bodies snapping to the position of attention. 500 hands raised in a crisp, simultaneous salute. Held in a silence so absolute, so heavy with reverence, it was deafening. It was the sound of loyalty. It was the sound of family. I began my walk down the aisle. My path was a narrow channel carved through this sea of honor. These were the men and women I had led, the faces I had seen in the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan. Their eyes as I passed held no idle curiosity. They held allegiance, they held respect, they held a fierce, protective love. I kept my gaze fixed forward on the calm, smiling face of Julian, my partner, my equal, my safe harbor. I did not spare a single glance for my blood family. In that moment, surrounded by my true family, they had ceased to matter. Our vows were as unique as our partnership. In the quiet of the chapel, we didn't promise riches or obedience. We promised to be each other's forward operating base in times of conflict and each other's secure rear echelon in times of peace. We swore an oath to be partners in every campaign life would throw at us. When the chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, the applause was thunderous. As we turned to walk out, a new honor awaited. An arch of sabers had been formed, but it wasn't the traditional six-man detail. Dozens of officers stood in two long lines, their polished sabers raised to form a glittering tunnel of steel that stretched from the chapel doors far out into the bright Virginia sun. Walking through that archway of honor, hand in hand with Julian, the sounds of celebration ringing in my ears, my eyes scanned the crowd. I caught a glimpse of Serafina. She was standing near the back, no longer in the family pew, but on the periphery, an outsider looking in. She wasn't clapping. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her face a pale, frozen mask of defeat. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. Then, like a ghost fading in the daylight, she turned and simply vanished into the dispersing crowd. She had lost. She hadn't been defeated by a single word of mine. She had been defeated by the truth of my life, a life she could never diminish, and a family she could never touch. Our wedding reception wasn't held in a fancy hotel ballroom with crystal chandeliers. It was held in a cavernous aircraft hangar on the base, the only place large enough to contain my real family. There were no elegant round tables with floral centerpieces. Instead, long, simple folding tables were lined up in rows, and coolers filled with ice and beer were stationed every few yards. The air was loud, not with a string quartet, but with booming laughter, with war stories being retold, with the vibrant, chaotic energy of people who had lived life at its most extreme. Marines came up to me and Julian all evening, but not for formal congratulations. They came to share a piece of their lives with me. Master Sergeant Diaz, the man I'd pulled from the burning Humvee, grasped my hand in both of his grip firm. "Thank you for being at my wife's funeral last year, ma'am," he said, his voice thick. "You flew halfway around the world. I'll never forget that." A young female pilot, no older than 25, told me that my story was the reason she had found the courage to join the Marine Corps aviation program. This wasn't a wedding reception. It was a living testament to my true legacy, one built not on grand titles, but on 1,000 small, unseen acts of leadership and loyalty. Later that night, long after the last beer had been drunk and the hangar had fallen silent, Julian and I were in our hotel suite. The adrenaline of the day had faded, and in its place, I didn't feel the triumphant thrill of victory I'd expected. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow emptiness. The lifelong war with Serafina was finally over, and its conclusion had left a profound silence in my soul, like the ringing in your ears after a loud explosion ceases. It was the quiet of an empty battlefield. Julian, of course, saw it immediately. He came and sat beside me on the edge of the bed, not saying anything, just taking my hand in his. His presence was a silent anchor in the swirling sea of my emotions. "I feel empty," I admitted, the words barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze full of understanding. "Every war has an aftermath, Tenna," he said softly. "You've been conditioned to fight for so long. Now, you have to learn how to live in the peace you've won." His words were simple, but they cut to the heart of it. I had won. But victory had also come with a loss. The loss of a sister, even a toxic one. The final, definitive death of a hope I hadn't even realized I was still clinging to. A quiet, aching sadness settled over me, not for the woman Serafina was, but for the little girl inside me who had once, a long time ago, desperately wanted a real sister to share her secrets with. My parents had slipped away right after the ceremony, without so much as a goodbye. Their departure was less of a surprise and more of a quiet confirmation of what I already knew. The next morning, I sat alone by the window, watching the calm gray waters of the Potomac River flow steadily toward the sea. I took out my phone and opened my contacts list. I scrolled to their names, father and mother. I had kept their numbers for years, through every deployment, through every silent holiday, holding onto a microscopic sliver of hope that one day they might call just to say they were proud. But that day would never come. Their actions at my wedding were the final proof. I took a deep breath, a long, slow exhale that felt like I was releasing decades of pent-up waiting. Then, I performed a small symbolic ritual of liberation. I deleted their numbers. There was no anger, no hatred, just a quiet, serene acceptance. It was time to stop waiting for something that would never arrive. It was time to write the final chapters of my story, untethered from their approval. Just as I pressed delete on my mother's contact, an email notification pinged on my screen. My heart clenched. The subject line was a single, jarring word. Serafina. I braced myself for another attack, another volley of vitriol. My thumb hovered over the delete button, but a morbid curiosity made me open it. The email was not what I expected. There was no sarcasm, no manipulation. It was short, cold, and shockingly honest. It read, "Yesterday, Father told me I embarrassed him. For the first time in my life, I saw that he was wrong. They didn't stand up for the stars on your shoulders, Tenna. They stood up because you stood up for them. We don't salute blood. We salute truth." That was it. It wasn't an apology. It was a concession. It was a truce declared on the battlefield of our lifelong war. It wasn't an act of love, but it was, in its own strange way, an act of respect. For the first time, Serafina had seen me, not through the distorted lens of her own jealousy, but for what I actually was. She had seen the truth. And that, in the quiet of my hotel room, with the river flowing endlessly outside, was the closure I never knew I needed. Years passed. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan faded from the headlines, replaced by new conflicts and new challenges. I now stood in my office on the E-ring of the Pentagon, a place that had once been my personal battlefield of bureaucracy. From my window, I had a clear view of the Washington Monument, a stark, white needle piercing the sky. The office was no longer a place of struggle. It was my command center. Project Aegis was no longer a fledgling side project funded by my savings. It had become a fully institutionalized, multi-million-dollar program, a mandatory policy across all branches of the armed forces. It had saved thousands of lives, not with bullets, but with counseling, with compassion. With the simple, revolutionary act of seeing a warrior's invisible wounds and treating them with honor. I no longer had to fight for a seat at the table in these conference rooms. Now, I was the one who chaired the meetings, implementing the kind of ethical, empathetic leadership reforms I had spent my entire career fighting for. The work was still immense, the battles were still there, but they were now battles of my own choosing. I looked out at the monument, and for the first time, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. A peace not given to me, but built by my own hands. One spring afternoon, I was invited to be the guest speaker at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Standing before thousands of bright-eyed midshipmen, the future leaders of the Navy and Marine Corps, I didn't speak of tactics or strategy. I didn't recount tales of battle. I spoke about the true cost of leadership, about the profound sacred responsibility a commander has for the mental and spiritual well-being of their troops. I spoke about Corporal Evans. I told them that the bravest thing a leader can do is not to charge into fire, but to create a space where their people feel safe enough to admit they are hurting. When I finished, the entire hall rose to their feet in a wave of applause that felt like a validation of my life's work. As my eyes scanned the vast audience, they landed on a familiar face in the guest section. It was Serafina. She was no longer the smug, perfectly polished media star. She looked older, her face softer, stripped of its usual armor of irony. She too was standing, and she was clapping. Our eyes met across the crowded hall for a long moment. No words were exchanged, none were needed. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something more honest. It was respect. A respect that had been paid for with a lifetime of pain and persistence. After the speech, as I was shaking hands, a young, sharp-looking Marine captain approached me. She had a firm handshake and a pair of eyes that shone with unwavering determination. "General Floyd," she said, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Captain Eva Rostova. My father is Master Sergeant Diaz." My heart seemed to stop for a beat. I remembered Diaz vividly. his desperate eyes in the smoke of Fallujah. He told me the story of the day you saved his life more times than I can count, she continued, a small smile playing on her lips. He said you were the definition of what a leader should be. When I was born, my mother gave me the middle name, Tenna, after you. She squared her shoulders, a gesture so familiar it made me ache. You, ma'am, are the reason I am standing here today. I looked at this brilliant, capable young officer, a woman ready to lead her own Marines, and I finally saw my legacy in its truest form. It wasn't the stars on my shoulders or the policies I had passed. It wasn't a name on a building or a footnote in a history book. It was standing right here in front of me, alive, breathing, and full of promise. The final circle closed a year later, at a ceremony honoring my retirement after more than 3 decades of service. As the formal event wound down, a man I hadn't spoken to in years approached me through the crowd. He was older now, his back slightly stooped, the formidable presence I remembered, softened by age. It was my father. Tenna, he said, his voice thick and trembling slightly. I was wrong. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me, his eyes filled with a lifetime of unspoken regret. I was so blind, so focused on the superficial things, on appearances, that I couldn't see the diamond right in front of me. He took a shaky breath. I am so proud of you. He reached out and pulled me into an awkward, unpracticed, but profoundly sincere hug. It was the hug I'd been waiting for since I was a little girl. In that moment, the last of the ice in my own heart finally melted. The cycle of hurt was over. That night, sitting quietly beside Julian, I found myself thinking back to Serafina's email from all those years ago. I remembered the final, stark line, "We don't salute blood. We salute truth." I smiled, a real, peaceful smile. She had been right. My life had been a long, brutal, and beautiful campaign to prove that very point. And I realized then that the sweetest revenge, the most profound victory, wasn't about winning at all. It was about truth. It was about forgiveness. And it was about the quiet, unshakable strength you find in standing tall in your own honor, showing others that they can do the same. My journey taught me one profound lesson. You are the sole author of your own honor. The voices from your past or your present that try to diminish you can be loud. But the truth of who you are, forged in your own fires, is always louder. This story is my truth. But I know I'm not alone in fighting these battles. So many of us have had to build our own chosen families and define our own success against the odds. If you believe in the power of stories that give strength to the resilient, I invite you to become part of our community here at Chosen Revenge. Please like this story if it touched you, and subscribe so you never miss another chapter in our shared journey. Thank you for listening.